Do you want me to move the snickerdoodle?
Yeah, let's do that. Probably, okay.
Okay.
So I think my dissertation was probably one of the first ones that dealt with organized crime from a political science perspective. Of course, there's a lot of studies in criminology that have dealt, with deviancy and why individuals commit crime, and there's this whole body of work in criminology. The reality is, like, we don't really talk to them or speak to them that much, but thinking more about political science and looking at organized crime as stakeholders and why it merited to be researched. In the case of Mexico, I'm sure there's a lot, of course, of local production from countries like Colombia, Brazil, but thinking about kind of like political science in the US, studying Mexican organized crime, so within that framework. And I would say certainly that I was very lucky that I had an advisor that supported that work. At the time, it was not common. When I was still at USMex, we started getting increasingly more applications from fellows who wanted or were working on organized crime or some form of violence in Mexico. And I think that they'll keep seeing more applications like that in the years to come. And I think that's fantastic. I absolutely think we need more people thinking about, organized crime and violence. Not only in Mexico, just in the region, in Latin America. But at the time, this was not the norm. And so because I had, I wanted to work with an advisor who specialized in Mexico, and this is Kate Brune, she supported it. And, it was kind of like down that rabbit hole. And so what it was interesting is that, I had this interest in looking at organized crime, but there was not a ton to inform that. So really a lot of my work is informed, or those early ideas were informed by studies on terrorism and armed conflict that specifically looked at actors, and there are different reasons for why they acted the way they did, which in turn is also heavily informed by economic theory, looking at the principal agent model. And so I ended up taking a bunch of classes in the econ department, which was not necessarily the funnest thing to do, but it was definitely helpful to kind of inform my thinking at the time. And so what I ended up doing is, so some of the early works, and this is still something that you see a lot of when you look at organized crime, is a relationship of organized crime with the state. And of course, I think that is a very important dynamic that should be looked at and studied. But I didn't want to look at that. I thought, well, regardless of the relationship to the state, there's still different ways in which they behave. And these are not randomly assigned or exogenously given. They have different ways of acting because they have different structures, and this motivates different behavior. And so what I ended up doing was building a mid-level theory, a typology of criminal groups from Mexico, to try to understand first how their structure, and then how this structure informed the violence that we saw they were committing, the type of violence specifically, why some of them went into extortion and kidnapping and others did not, and how they launder money as well, kind of the methods that they looked at. And so from that framework that essentially says, they're not all the same. They're all criminals, but they are not all the same. That has really sort of remained the core idea that to this day informs my work. And so what I'm doing with that right now is connected to fentanyl trafficking, because of course, within organized crime, you have quite the menu of illicit activities that you can look at. And I would say specifically, I look at drug trafficking and money laundering. Those are the two, of course, there's migrant smuggling, especially here at the border, but I don't specialize in that. And so with fentanyl, it has been interesting because a couple of years ago, well, no, more than a couple, it's like the pandemic kind of has twisted my timeline. I don't know if that's your experience, but definitely mine. We wanted to look with a group of colleagues to really have a better understanding of opium poppy production in Mexico, because even though Mexico, a few years ago, this is no longer the case, was ranked like second or third, depending on the year, as opium poppy producer in the world, we didn't really know much about it. And so with colleagues who brought different regional expertise to the table, we set out to look at, okay, how is this economy organized? And is it different in different parts of Mexico, or is it not? What should we expect? So we ended up doing that, and I focused on the Sinaloa part. And it was very interesting because we did find some very significant regional differences, which also explain why some places were, and I don't love this word, but I'll just use it for now, resilient to heroin demand dropping in the US, while others were definitely not so well positioned, meaning that people who were opium poppy growers in these regions were much more damaged by the lack of, an income now, because simply middlemen who would come and buy opium gum from them were no longer coming, right? So this income that was useful for them to sustain their families was no longer there. So with fentanyl, what we're trying to do is a number of things. One is connect the research agendas that have to do with the production side, the trafficking side, and then also the consumption side. There's a lot of work, San Diego State has a joint program with UCSD on public health that looks at people who use drugs. And the reality is that even though these two should be connected, these conversations happen very isolated from each other. The public health crowd is very much kind of like in their own thing, and then people like me also just talking to other people like myself. And so what we want to do is we should really have a conversation around what's happening on the consumer side, but also on the production side. And of course the border offers a great space to do that, because this is where a lot of those dynamics also converge. So marrying those agendas, it's a lot harder to do than we anticipated, but we're getting there. Baby steps, we are getting there. And the other thing that we're trying to do is really try to understand how fentanyl has changed drug markets. It is true that fentanyl has changed dynamics within the illicit market, but it's certainly not this, far right notion of, cartels wanting to kill you, right? And so pushing back, producing evidence basically that helps push back against this notion that your drug dealer is trying to kill you, which frankly he or she is not. That's just bad business. They're not trying to kill you. And so understanding that even though it was a supply driven phenomenon, this was not more people demanding fentanyl, but rather it started getting into the supply. But now you have a cohort of users who actually want fentanyl. So it's, of course, you still have people who use it, not necessarily wanting to use fentanyl, but now you also have a cohort of people who use it because they specifically want to use fentanyl. And so what I'm working on right now is with Inside Crime, this think tank from DC, and try to understand how consumption looks on the Mexican side of the border. And a lot of this has to do with an interest from the US government in understanding these dynamics. And part of it derives from two things. One is Mexico, at least the last administration, we haven't heard anything from the new government, officially denied that fentanyl is illicitly manufactured in the country. So that's, kind of it's very problematic, right? When you try to put together a drug policy, but you can't even agree on the facts. I mean, any policy, right? But if you cannot even agree on the facts, then it becomes extremely challenging. And then the other thing is Mexico used to also have a survey on substance use, and that was defunded by the previous administration as well. And so basically the last data that we have on drug use from Mexico is from 2016, but the data it was collected in 2015. So we're talking almost a decade old, which of course does not reflect these dynamics. So then what we're trying to understand, even within the limitations of not being able to carry a national representative survey, is by visiting different locations, try to understand how this consumption and how this use looks like. So a few things that are interesting from this work initially is, and these are still very preliminary and these are not necessarily final findings, but some interesting questions that have come out is, first, the retail market is very organized. So in places, for instance, like Tijuana or Mexicali, people cannot just buy, like I cannot just go to my drug dealer and say like, hey, give me, 100 grams of fentanyl. They tell you, no, there's a 50 peso bag and there's a 100 peso bag. Which one do you want? And you can buy, of course, as many of those as you want, but it's structured in these amounts. It's like you can buy 50 pesos or 100 pesos, and that's what you get. And this is also similar to a place like Hermosillo, which is not a border city, but it's very close to the border in Sonora. And so it's interesting to find these very high level of organization, which if you think about it also from the business side, which is what I spend a lot of my time doing, this is very easy also for accounting, right? Like if I gave you 50 bags, right, that were for 100 pesos and I gave you 50 bags for 50 pesos, like that really makes it easier to account for whoever is in your retail point. How much do they sell, how much do they owe you, and sort of also how much are you supplying to them. And it's not only organized in terms of the amount each bag has and how much they sell it to you for, but they also have specific markings so that dealers know that you're actually buying from the dealer that kind of corresponds to your area.
Region. Oh wow.
Yes. So, and it's not even regions. We're talking about like neighborhood level organization, right? So like this blue sticker is for this neighborhood and this green sticker is this other neighborhood. And the idea behind that is so that I can track, people who are supposed to be within my area, if you're actually purchasing from me or not. And this is very interesting because it creates a lot of invisible borders within cities, right? I think it's very counterintuitive to think that dealers don't want to sell to anyone, but we have found that's true. They don't take any customers because there is a value in controlling, your street or your corner. And so if I don't know you, I'm not going to sell to you because what if you are from, someone who wants to take over my corner. And so what's interesting about this is that violence is not happening at the trafficking level in the transnational space, right? I think in the transnational space, what we find is organizations actually want as little friction as possible. So this is why we see the reports, right, that most people who have been sentenced for fentanyl trafficking are U.S. citizens, right? I'm going to try to bribe Border Patrol officers on both sides of the border because what I want to have in a space that has uncertainty and where I cannot just go to the judge and complain is to reduce the amount of uncertainty that I have. So in that trafficking space, and not to say, of course, that trafficking organizations are not violent, of course they are, and I'll get to that in a second. But the most violence that we see is at the retail level. It's not the trafficking. So this is important because I think a lot of the pop culture narrative around drug trafficking is that drug markets are by design violent, but that's not true. And we have, a long history in Mexico to show that that's actually not the case. There are other dynamics that can become violent. So users actually, people who use drugs on a regular basis, are actually the ones who are at the most risk in terms of lethal violence. And again, because the dealer may not know you or because the substance has been adulterated. So there's those concerns. Another interesting finding, and I think this is very relevant for us here at the border, is that when we have interviewed people who have been using, heroin for 20, 30 years, a lot of them are Mexican citizens, but who spent, 20, 30 years in the United States, and they started their use in the US. And then they got deported either because they were incarcerated or there was something else. But a lot of the people that we have, and again, this is not necessarily a representative sample, but it's interesting, these are the people who go to harm reduction spaces, which tells you that they, of course, have a know-how and are trying to, again, reduce the harm of injecting drugs. So they go and get new needles, get naloxone, but they start their use on the US side of the border. And so I think that's an interesting area for policy because a lot of people who are, Mexico, rightfully so, calls it repatriated to Mexico, are not necessarily tracked once they're back in Mexico, right? So Mexico accepts Mexican nationals I know your back, but I don't really know anything else from you. And so one thing that would be important is if you are someone who uses drugs regularly and inject drugs, being able to offer those services to you on the Mexican side is important. Some of them find them, some of them deliberately stay in the border region, one, because they don't necessarily feel connected with from wherever in Mexico they were from, but also because they want to be close to these harm reduction spaces that exist in the border and not in other places in the country. So that's definitely, something. It's very important, especially considering that, there's a lot more overdoses happening in prison than outside prison. And of course, this is very problematic for a number of reasons. Now, one thing that we found just recently, and we don't really have a good explanation for this, is in some places in Mexico, they will sell fentanyl to you in like this powder form, right? And you cannot really find pills. And now CBP is very concerned about machinery that it's basically pill pressing machines that are being imported into the US, meaning that the final product is being manufactured in the US. And so what's interesting here is a couple of things. Well, many things, but I'll highlight two. One is that fentanyl, unlike other substances, looks a lot more like a North American drug. And I'll tell you why. So if you buy a car made in North America, the reality is like the parts of this car cross the border multiple times, right? It's not that it was made in Mexico and then exported to the US. It's like different parts, cross the border multiple times until you have the final product. And with fentanyl, what we're finding is that this is similar because precursors are not only coming from China to Mexico, they're also coming to the US to Mexico. So you have precursors that come to the US, cross to Mexico, then fentanyl is manufactured in Mexico, then it crosses the border, but then you have a final product that is assembled in the US. This dynamic of trying to do the final product in the US is very similar to a dynamic that we saw in the 80s with cocaine, when Colombian organizations try to finish or try to manufacture cocaine in the US. And that's when the crackdown really came down hard on them, where the US law enforcement was like, no, this is where we draw the line. You're not going to be making cocaine like in US territory. So it'll be interesting to see what happens, because of course these are different substances in terms of enforcement, now that there's this sense that there's pill pressing happening also here, and it's not that the final product just comes from Mexico or China. And the other part that's interesting is, and this is, again, we need more research for this, but if you want to finish the product here, if you want to finish, press the pill here, that suggests that there's also more adulteration happening on the US side. Like you're still, sort of try to thin out or, add whatever to the supply also in the US. And so you have that dynamic as well. But again, those are more hypotheses than actual findings, but there's a relevant question as to why do you want to finish the product in the US, especially when a lot of the talk around fentanyl has been, oh, it's so easy to transport because you can move like much smaller amounts, right? And so there's that question up there. And this leads me to the final part, and then let's open it up for conversation, which has to do with like doing research in these spaces, right? And so I think for a lot of work that has to do with violence, frankly, IRB procedures are very inadequate and fall very short, right, from what we need and what you actually find when you are in these spaces. And so of course I believe and I support having these reviews of your methodology, but the reality is that, you can fill out an IRB form and it will always, in my opinion, from what I have found in the last decade, it's not going to be sufficient to, okay, how do you act when you are in this context? And I'll give you a few examples. So because we're currently researching, people who use drugs and they go to harm reduction spaces, a lot of the time these are people who use, they inject between 6 to 8 times a day. And so essentially they do that because they're trying to avoid any withdrawal symptoms from not using opioids. And so the question there becomes, and this is, I don't necessarily have the answer, but if you're interviewing them, for instance, in a safe consumption site, right? And you tell them, hey, I'm working on this, could we talk? And they say yes, and they inject, which, of course they're free to do. And then they start, going into the effects of the substance. What do you do there as a researcher? And so there's no IRB form that helps with that, right? And, we're not paying them for their participation because we had a whole discussion around how that creates some questions, but we also don't want to be extractivist researchers. And this is something that I'm also always very conscious about. I don't just want to go into spaces and take something that will benefit me professionally, and then it's like, well, have a good day, there. You've served the need that I had, right? So it's okay, how do we create a relationship in this context where they are trying to avoid these withdrawal symptoms that they will be injecting, but you do want to have a conversation with them. And so these are not necessarily easy questions to answer, but this is part of the reality of working in those spaces. And similarly, I think in the context of especially organized crime, and in political science, they don't really teach us these. They don't, like they do in anthropology or sociology, about positionality, right? And who am I when I'm here, right? Like we don't have those conversations. It's more like, making sure you know your R. But I think, when you're doing qualitative work, these become very relevant, especially in these contexts where it's like, how do I get access to the places that I get access to? And that means that a lot of time we're working with local stakeholders, right? And then the question is like, okay, who are they in our research? Are they also our co-authors? Are they our partners? How do we treat them, right? And I have made a decision, for instance, that, every time I work with a journalist, I acknowledge, they're very much part of the research team. I have colleagues who have made the opposite decision. It's like, I pay you, this is more like a fixing relationship, like you took me to the places that you need to take me to, but this is my work and this is my research and you don't need to appear. I don't agree with that stance. I think we also need to be a lot more transparent of how we gain access to the places that we do. And this is in part because, and I'll close with this, I don't believe that they are inaccessible spaces. There are inaccessible spaces for us at times, but these places that we think of, oh, this is a conflict setting, that's someone's home, right? Like someone lives in these parts, otherwise we would not necessarily be going there. And that means there are people there, there's a community, there's people who call that, their home. And so it's a lot of times, this is, very much the case in Mexico, but I don't think it's limited to that. It's who do you know that then allows you to, that they'll let this other person know, that's gonna let this other person know that you're there so that you can be there, right? And this happened, for instance, working on the opium poppy work and being in Badiraguato, which has this whole charge of, the narco imaginary. But again, people live there. This is not a small municipality. And so it's like, how do you were able then to navigate that access? And I think, for those of us who study conflict, again, we need to be a lot more transparent about that and that relationship. And basically, if it means that you work with this person and they got you access to this part, it also means there was a trade-off somewhere else. And I don't think there's anything wrong with acknowledging that and saying, every research will have limitations. So I'll stop there because I've been talking for a while, but yeah, happy to chat about anything.
So I'll start off, I guess, with my question. So you highlighted the simultaneous health crises in the U.S., opioid overdoses, with also homicides in Mexico. How do you think a joint U.S.-Mexico public health strategy could be structured in these sorts of situations?
Sure. It's interesting, right? Because incentive-wise, right now Mexico and the US should be having very intense conversations, right, about how do we address this. But this is arguably one of the worst moments in U.S.-Mexico security cooperation, with the finger pointing, and of course elections never help either, because Mexico becomes a piñata, and we know how that goes. I had the pleasure of sitting across from Jim Jordan for 5.5 hours in Congress, so listening to delights like that. And so I think part of the challenge that we have now, and this is something that I mentioned briefly, is there's no agreement on facts. And I think the first step is to have an agreement on facts. And I think, with heroin, for instance, or opium poppy, there was always some level of disagreement. The US would say Mexico had, however many acres of opium poppies produced or grown this year. And Mexico would say, no, it wasn't 57, it was 53. But there was no disagreement on whether they were grown, right? Maybe we disagreed on the amount, but not on whether or not this was the reality. And right now it's basically parallel universes, right? With the US saying there's fentanyl that's produced in Mexico, and Mexico saying no, and this is your problem. So not great. So I think the first step would be to get to that. Now, how do we manage that? I think there's, on the US side, I think, the previous administration, the Lopez Obrador administration, was very critical of the Drug Enforcement Administration. And it didn't like how it operated in country. And, the US Embassy in Mexico is massive. It has upwards of 50 agencies in the country. And of course, even having alignment within those agencies in Mexico is complicated. Sometimes I would even make the case they work at cross purposes, right? So you will have someone like USAID, working on violence prevention programs, but then you have someone like Drug Enforcement Administration allowing criminal activities to take place in the hopes that will get them information that would allow them to, build a case around a kingpin hit. But all this to say that the concern about the effectiveness of the DEA doing in-country operations is not unfounded. I think there's a legitimate question there of, okay, show me actual activities the DEA has done in the country, not only Mexico, but other places, that have actually resulted in meaningful reductions of supply, which is arguably one of the stated goals of the DEA. And I don't think there's a very good example of that. And if anything, some of the worst corruption scandals in the US actually are from the DEA. So these concern about, well, we don't think that has been effective, I feel like that has fallen on, deaf ears on the US side, seeing it as like, oh, Mexico just doesn't want to cooperate. And then, of course, not renewing like the parking spot of the DEA, at this Mexican airport, that comes across as a tantrum, right? Rather than, but so that hasn't been ideal. So I think there has to be an acknowledgement of, yes, maybe what we have done for the last 50 years hasn't always worked. And in fact, in some cases, you could make the argument it has been detrimental. But there are other areas of cooperation that we could, look at. I think Mexico also needs to be less crass about the tremendous loss of life that the US has had through the opioid overdose deaths. And having the Mexican president say, well, they die because, people use drugs there because they have divorced parents. And this is actually what he said. I'm not making this up. And saying that naloxone, like, what's the point? It's just prolonging suffering. That's not how a partner and a neighbor behaves. Like that, those statements are just not helpful to the relationship. And so I think, having a much more, acknowledging, yes, you have lost tremendously in the same way that we lose, through homicides. It's important, especially at a time when Mexico is asking the US to care about all the deaths through firearms that happen in the country. So there's 70% of homicides in Mexico happen with a firearm, and Mexico has one gun store. So obviously firearms trafficking, a huge issue. I think right now, best case scenario, we'll see something by next summer, but that's best case scenario. That's assuming the people in charge like each other, and they want to actually move forward. And right now, for instance, Mexico has not even named an ambassador to the US because, of course, they're waiting to see what happens with elections in the US because it's a very different playbook, depending on who wins. And so there's not going to be any movement there. And regardless of who wins in November here, we know there's going to be a new ambassador also of the US to Mexico. And so, yeah, I don't expect Ambassador Salazar to remain in the post long after, again, whoever wins in November. So assuming that they want to work together on this and that they like each other and want to have these exchanges of information, best case scenario this summer, but we'll see.
Yeah, I can ask a question. Yeah, just want to mention like one thing that actually like I feel like really summarizes Mexico's position on drug and the U.S. relationship is one of the last statements President López Obrador made was criticizing the DEA for basically arresting El Mayo Zambada and their operations in Mexico. So I feel like that really summarizes well the López Obrador administration's position on like drug enforcement and U.S.-Mexico relations. But I wanted to ask, so I know you work on the field and you mentioned how basically most of the conflict that happens is at the like local level between like dealers fighting for territory, kind of stuff. Am I correct?
I mean, I would say
Yeah.
in drug markets
Yeah.
in specific cities, but definitely not like the violence in the country.
Yeah, of course.
Right.
Yeah, so I've always thought that one, I'm not sure, like perhaps your expertise could like help me figure out this, but I've always thought that perhaps one of the measures the Mexican government could implement that would hopefully like solve that problem, because that's what's actually more present for common day like citizens in Mexico. That's that type of violence. They're not seeing the violence that happens like at the border, or they're not seeing violence that happens anywhere else. It's normally fighting for the plaza. So would like legalizing drugs help solve that problem? Like get rid of like anything, make all drugs legal, basically.
I mean, I think these are two different questions,
Yeah.
right? And I think it's part of the debate of drug policy debate. And I think the question about legalizing or at least have a better regulation around substances, yes, it's a very needed one. And I think there's very good evidence from other parts of the world that actually the more regulated the market is, the safer the consumer is. And so I think on that level, in terms of taking care of people who use drugs, which let's face it is a majority of people, it's better. I think the question of does this reduce violence, I think the answer is no. And we have a great example with opium poppy in Mexico, because I would argue fentanyl has been the most effective drug policy ever. There is no eradication program that has eliminated opium poppies in Mexico the way that the demand for fentanyl has done in the country. And yet, these communities, you don't have opium poppy anymore, but you still have violence in them because it's not only related to drug markets. And so I think the challenge here is, do we want a more progressive, people-centered drug policy? Absolutely. But to think that that's going to take care of violence, I think that would be a miscalculation, especially in markets where the business model of the criminal groups requires a public display of violence. And this is very much the case in extortion markets, for instance, or cobro de piso. So if I come to your business and now I invite you to pay me, 10% of your earnings every month, you have to believe that my threat is real, right? And in order to do that, I have to be very public about my violence and show you that also if you don't comply, there will be consequences. And so it's interesting because in working these extortion markets in Tijuana, documenting them, what we find is, violence is expensive. It's not cheap. I would argue the U.S. is heavily subsidizing criminal groups in Mexico through the easiness of acquiring firearms in the U.S., but it's still not, the cost is not zero and it's not, free. And so there's a letter that gets sent to your business first saying, hey, we're the new admin here, so now you're gonna pay me, 10% or 5% or whatever, and by the time they send that letter, they already have all the information on your business to know how much they can ask you to pay. And so I think in those markets, even if we had a progressive drug policy, that would not necessarily solve it. And also because other markets like fuel theft, for instance, they don't have anything to do with drugs. And so that would be I think what we're seeing is we're in this is not going to get solved under one administration. It's going to take several, and it's going to take a long time, and it goes through first understanding what are these illicit markets to begin with.
Yeah, it's true, because you can see the Sinaloa cartel with Jalisco Nueva Generación actually having like not only drugs, they don't only like traffic drugs, they also like traffic people, fuel, and like all that kind of stuff.
For avocados in southern Mexico,
Oh, yeah.
a huge cartel.
Exactly.
And the chocolates
I mean,
as
that's
well.
also a great example to your question, right? Like avocados,
Yeah.
because you have a legal market, right? And like clockwork, like every Super Bowl, wait for that story about like how you're helping extortionists in Mexico. But that's a legal market, right? And it's a very violent one, and that again, this idea that if you legalize drugs, then you'll reduce all violence. I wish that was the case.
Yeah, I wrote my thesis on the cartel, more on the state cartel side. But yeah, I wrote it, and I went in sort of analyzing cartel-state relationships, and I went in with sort of a class perspective, a Marxist perspective, and I think to me that sort of points towards at least, even if it necessarily doesn't produce an immediate sort of kind of policy initiative and everything, I think for me it sort of changes people, or at least the way that sort of we can perceive this thing. For me, I think, for example, too, like, we're speaking about how this violence sort of perpetuates itself against not only sort of the illicit markets, but we see it with avocados, and even sort of when it goes into sort of other forms. I think, to me, the way that I in my thesis I wrote, and I sort of still to this day comprehend cartels and everything, is that they really seem to represent a sort of capitalist market relation that's sort of at the most sort of unhinged level. I don't know if you would sort of agree with that, and that to me sort of seems to really lead to sort of the need for competition, the need to sort of secure that competition to sort of gain your own profit market and incentive and everything. I don't know, that to me is where I sort of a lot of the violent approach, or at least that's what I wrote, sort of that where it emerges in my thesis. So I don't know if you sort of agree with that narrative or your perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the most interesting things that anyone has ever said to me in an interview, speaking specifically about Sinaloa, they were like, the business is money. And that really, has made me think for years now about that. And yes, so the business is not fentanyl or cocaine or,
Right.
Whatever. The business is money. And so that also means that the most lucrative parts of the business are the most unsexy ones that no one wants to pay attention to, right? Like, no one wants to talk about logistics, right? Like, I'm sure some people, like some other businessmen will do, but I'm sure no one in this room is here because, I love logistics. Let's discuss that, right? Or like, yes, warehousing, and inventory, like, but that's really where a lot of the money is, right? And so what I am charging you for, when I, to your point, when I first started my work, I had these hypotheses that, criminal groups that were more structure would not necessarily be interested in like cheaper drugs, right? Like, so meth and like, those would be for other types of criminal groups. And very quickly I found out that I was very wrong, because the business is not necessarily, just selling what's pricey, but charging you for getting it to the border, right? And so for Mexican organized crime, specifically involving drug trafficking, the business is crossing it to the US, and until you sell it in the US, no one really along the supply chain gets paid. And so, hence the creative markings also, packages and things. And I think to your point, yes, if what you want is money, then that creates different competition, right? And the interest in having territory and making sure that I can, exert control there. I think the difference, and this is part of the challenge of what we're seeing today, is that today they have much more material ability to exercise that violence that they had 30 years ago, right? So maybe 30 years ago I also wanted to do that, but I didn't necessarily have the means to do it. And today I'm, I can do it, right? Because I can buy a caliber 50 weapon legally in the US and then get it, to Mexico, where, and then trafficking has become a business also in itself.
Yeah. I really liked your point on the way that the sort of the the product that they're trafficking or sort of engaging in really transforms, I think, the structural organizations of these. In my research and everything, I think for me, one sort of point, I went in with a sort of historical approach, and to me, where I started writing about sort of where the modern cartel or conception of it really begins to emerge, I think, is really when they start transporting cocaine, which I feel like the sort of the revenue became so insane, and at the same time the PRI structure started kind of eroding and everything, and that allowed for it's like an unprecedented amount of state capture at the local level and etc. So yeah, I don't know why in my probably because I was pressed up against time to get it submitted and published.
Aren't we always?
Yeah. But the fentanyl thing is something that I think in my thesis was lacking. So this has been really insightful.
I mean, but you only have so much time, right? I mean,
yeah, I was very like very last day I submitted it. So I was, but yeah. But yeah, the fentanyl thing, I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, but I agree with you. Yes. I mean, and cocaine also, of course, changed the relationships, right, with like Colombians and other criminal associates in the region. What's funny now, right, with fentanyl is now this discussion about like Mexico being everywhere. I was talking to a government official in Ecuador, and they were saying, I'm working with them on a project, and one of them made the point of like, oh, we're so happy that you're, Mexican, because as you know, all the organized crime in Ecuador is Mexican, so you can really help us. And I'm like,
great.
Do I know that? I don't actually know that. I don't know, the nationality of the organized crime in Ecuador, but similar to the narrative of Colombians in the 80s, I feel like we're now in that space in the region where, I've had different calls with governments where they tell me, we don't want to become Mexico, so how do we avoid that? And, of course, if you look at basic indicators of violence, that's not, I can see where they're coming from. But yes, I think there's a lot of, potential for a lot more better work again on fentanyl, that it's not just, the cartel is trying to kill you, because again, they're not.
Yeah, that's awesome. So I have a more pragmatical question for you. I'm very interested in conflict resolution, but more to the war-torn places. But I'd like to know from your experiences, which are some avenues as a researcher to influence stakeholders to create new policies or to innovate and tackle this problem in a more research-based way.
It's very slow. Like I would say, I wouldn't take anything from my research and say like, here, this thing, like change the thinking of, now we have this amazing new policy because of, this idea I had. Not at all. Like I would not say that, at least at this point in my career. But I think, there are definitely, I think it has to be a more let's meet in the middle relationship, meaning that you're not going to have a conversation like you have in seminar, right? You're not going to, you're like, oh, well, let me just pull out like all the theory on conflict resolution and tell you why I'm right, which essentially for 5 years we're trained to, argue why we're right all the time, right? So in working with government, like forget about that. Like that's not what you're going to be doing. But I do think, they're like find a space where there's a possibility for even having a conversation, and that's not necessarily easy to do, and it takes definitely a lot of patience, and I think it also takes a lot of repetition. You're not gonna just show up and say like, hey, here I have this. Like when I'm in DC, I say the same things over and over again, like the 3 talking points, and those are the ones that I'm constantly, hammering. And is there more behind that? Absolutely. Like, would I love to, share like, the specificity of like, why Nogales is so important, go back to, the first railway that existed within Mexico and the US, connected Sinaloa to Nogales. Yes, of course, but I don't have time for that. So I don't go into the history, for instance, of the railway and how that explains these connections of Sinaloa to the US-Mexico border. And I would say, and this has made, in my experience at least, it has made a difference. There are definitely gender dynamics in leadership, and I have found that women tend to be more open to creative thinking. And so not to say like, oh, there's no men in space that do that, but insecurity, you know, because it has been dominated for so long by men, there's also, I think, a lot of entrenchment of ideas, right? And so I think, you know, if you work with, you know, I have seen, and again, this is just my experience, when I work with women, there tends to be a lot more space for that creative thinking and flexibility.
Nice, that's great. I think I will email you. Awesome, that's so nice.
Kind of adding to that point, how much you think Claudia Sheinbaum, with her winning the election, might change some of these institutions and approach towards cartels? Do you see any positives or pitfalls in that process?
Right. So to be an awful political scientist, right? Like, we don't have a sample, right? Like, she has not been in office for a month.
Sure.
But I think, you know, that aside, I think, like, I want to see the glass half full, because of course these are not just intellectual matters to me. This is my country. I don't want to see the violence that we see. This is not a country that I grew up in, and I would want, you know, not to continue in this path of, you know, like next year saying, oh, now we have 130,000 people who are visually missing. Like, I don't think that's, you know, the path that I want. I'm concerned though about the fact that she seems to be, again, very close to the military and how she has supported them. I'm very concerned, you know, to your point of what's happening in Sinaloa right now. I think it was a very deliberate political message not to go to Sinaloa. She did go to Acapulco because there was a hurricane and there was a lot of devastation. And of course, I think, you know, as head of the state, she should be there. But I think she should also go to Sinaloa. She did send the public security secretary, which of course, you know, he's a cabinet level member, nothing to sneeze at. But the outrage coming out of Sinaloa right now, everyone is saying this is not the violence of always. We don't know what the end game is right now, and we're very concerned. And because in the imaginary of the country, Sinaloa is like this, you know, narco land. It's like, oh, it's just Sinaloa, so it's fine, right? And they're saying, no, it's not. Like, we don't, this is a lot different than other times. And I agree with that. A lot of times, I think, you know, working there, things seem readable and understandable, even when violent. It was not necessarily chaotic. And right now, there's a sense that things are not as understandable as they used to be. So the fact that she's not going there, I don't like that. I don't like that she, again, is very cozy with the military and essentially has said, I trust them, and, you know, they're great, and we're going to continue to use them, because there's extensive evidence that that's not the case. They don't reduce violence, right? The militarization is not actually solving things. And if you go to Tijuana, and this is, you know, I would add two things. One is there's a lot of confusion between outcome and output in security policies. And so if you go to Tijuana, you'll see the National Guard going around the city, you know, nonstop. And when was I there? Like a month ago I was there, and I was staying in Tijuana for the week. And there ended up being a shooting like right next to a coffee shop that I was at, and it's right next to the Attorney General's office. And the news from that day were not that there had been a shooting next to the Attorney General's office, but that it had happened within an area that the government has said, oh, this is like our safety area, which frankly is a scandal. It's like, no, the whole city should be the safety area. Like, why are you saying to me that only the wealthy get to feel safe, right? And so the news was where it happened, not that it had taken place. And of course, you know, again, you see this National Guard, and that's a lot of performance of security, but it's not necessarily security. And so I think you see, you know, with the National Guard a lot. And I think, you know, if I were to take whatever their, you know, gas bill is for the National Guard for 1 month and gave that to harm reduction organizations in Tijuana, I can assure you that I can actually show that they save more lives doing that than just going around the city, you know, with like a dude like standing behind a pickup truck, probably not holding his firearm correctly, like I would make the case, and having these, you know, random checkpoints in the city that again look like they're providing safety, but they don't really do that. So I don't think that's, that confusion of outcome and output is very problematic in terms of actually providing something. But, I want to give her the benefit of the doubt. We'll see, but things are not going great. Now, what I will say is that we, as the scholar community, the human rights community, we're doing something very wrong, because this message is not getting to your average citizen. They have very high levels of trust in the armed forces, not necessarily because they don't think they're corrupt. Like what we have found in the survey that we're doing on Mexican democracy is that they do perceive them to be corrupt, but it's very problematic for me, for instance, that today more people think they're accountable to civilian authorities than they did 3 years ago. That's actually not true. And so clearly we have a messaging problem in the activist space, and certainly scholars have a messaging problem in general, but that's a whole different conversation. But we're not able to send that message, and so for your average citizen, they actually trust them to do these things. And so this is a concern that I have, but I know average citizens do not.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
Sorry.
We are, yeah.
I just
Can I ask
Yeah.
a kind of unrelated question?
I think we are kind of in a rush, so if you go like very fast, we
it's
still
a
have a
very
couple minutes. Yeah.
Broad question. Like,
Sure.
I've heard that Mexico doesn't really take a solid stance on Israel, like in terms of the Gaza conflict. And I know that might be a bit outside of your field because it's not security in Mexico, but
Right.
do you know like why that is, or if that's not even true?
There is different things that Mexico has done in the context of the United Nations. However, traditionally, Mexican foreign policy is one of non-intervention. And so they tend to not pronounce themselves on anything, not only, Gaza, but just in general. They say, we want respect of our sovereignty, so we're not going to get involved. I think that's very rich when it comes to the U.S., for instance. Mexico saying that we have 52 consulates here, so I don't feel like you get to call the sovereignty card. But in general, I would say it goes back to that tradition of, this long-standing foreign policy. Whether or not that should be the foreign policy, I think that's a different question. But there are some actions that have been taken. I think the problem is that it has been sometimes contradictory between what Mexico did in the UN and then what López Obrador said in his pressers. And so it'll be interesting now that we have a Jewish president, if she takes a stance or not. I will say in her opening statement, she called herself a woman of faith. She didn't define what faith that was, but we'll see going forward.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you so much,
Thank you
Cecilia.
so
I really
much.
appreciate your time.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me.